Hello, everyone. This is Yaprak Özel, and I am with a distinguished guest, a professor of international relations, as you can see at the University of Kent, Harmonie Toros. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
And our topic of interest of or talk is very interesting. Actually, we are in negotiating process every day and every minute. But we are in conflict every day and every minute. And so this is not only of states, but also in person problems. And so I have tons of questions, of course, but limited time. And so Harmony is very familiar with Turkey. I will let her talk about that with respect to her topic of expertise. And also, she's an expert on different parts of the world, and she may also give us clues about that. And then I will proceed. Yes, Harmony, the floor is yours. Please tell us who you are, what you do for a living, an interesting topic.
Okay, hello. So I'm a reader in international conflict analysis, which means an associate professor, essentially. The British have their own lovely, peculiar terms. And which doesn't mean I am allowed to spend a lot of time reading, unfortunately, but although it should mean that. And I specialize particularly, therefore, in conflict analysis, conflict resolution, and I have done so for the past 15 years at least. I used to be a journalist. I was a journalist for French television to start with, and then I was based in Ankara and then in Istanbul for the Associated Press for 3 years, and then came back in 2003 for a little while longer. So I did take part in this wonderful profession that is journalism, and and then I decided that I had focused so much on conflict and studied so many conflicts that I really wanted to investigate them a little bit deeper. And I decided to do a master's in conflict resolution and then a PhD. And ever since, I've been studying conflict. And specifically, I've been studying negotiations in complex situations, particularly situations where the two parties are not symmetrical. So, where you have a very large, very powerful party on one side and a much smaller, less obviously powerful actor on the other. And there's a variety of examples of that. What it does is that it leads to specific dynamics of negotiations that need to be investigated and addressed. I've focused on many parts of the world. I've focused on the Philippines. I've focused on Northern Ireland. More recently, I've worked on Somalia and negotiations with Al-Shabaab. I was one of the first to look at the possibility of negotiating with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in the Philippines. So I've done a variety of those kinds of topics. What's interesting when you say that conflict is everywhere and all the time, I think you're absolutely right. But from my perspective, conflict is not something that is negative. In the sense that if we hadn't had conflict, you and I would not be where we are today. Women would not have the places they have. Minorities would not have the places they have, right? So conflict is what allowed a lot of all progress starts with conflict. That doesn't mean it
That's
has to
right.
be violent conflict. It doesn't have to. Conflict can be resolved non-violently, and that is my ultimate goal, right? Is how to reduce violence, not how to reduce conflict, but how to reduce violence.
Which is
And
great.
so when we think about, I have a 14-year-old daughter, and the only way she can grow up to become an independent human being is to be in conflict with me, um, and to distinguish herself from me, which I can understand. And as long as it is non-violent, I'm to a certain degree, most days, perfectly happy with that.
Well, that's a very different and very positive angle. But living in as a person in this world, I think we only see the conflict side, so it's not the opportunity side. Uh, but actually, you have been working with the Turkish government, so that is a part that I would just pinpoint. I gather that you have given a speech for the Turkish National Police, and you're still working for a NATO process or the project, which is also based in Ankara. So you know the dynamics about this country. So some of my questions will be dealing with the Turkish community and also politics. But okay, so conflict, starting from the point that conflict is not that negative. I should see it from a positive point. What is negotiation? How can you define a negotiation? Should there be a winner in a negotiation, or what is it? I mean, I'm sure there is another angle now that you will be surprising me about negotiation as well.
So it's interesting because I think you're perfectly right in saying before that negotiations are we are constantly negotiating. We're certainly constantly negotiating our relations, right? Our relations with other people, even when we're not doing so knowingly. So when there's a discussion in the kitchen on who washes the dishes, it is a negotiation. But often, not always, but often you're negotiating more than simply who is washing the dishes. You're also negotiating the relationship and the value of the relationship to each person, the value that is given to the time of the other person. Essentially what you're saying is how valuable is my time to you, right? And how valuable is your time to me. And that these are constant negotiations, and relations are constantly being negotiated in more obvious and less obvious ways, right? A divorce proceeding is the obvious negotiation, right? And it doesn't have to be acrimonious. It doesn't, even a divorce proceeding doesn't have to be acrimonious. There was a very interesting BBC series called The Split, which follows a divorce lawyer, and at the end, part of the series is her own divorce, and it's really interesting because in the beginning she goes through another lawyer, and it becomes very acrimonious and very difficult, and at one point they both say stop, and they go to their house and they sit down and they work through it in a completely different way, which is what is in the best interests of our children and what is in our best interests, right? And so this is the classic sort of separation between what is seen as hard bargaining, most of all positional bargaining, which is I have this position, you have this position, and we will fight it out until one of us wins, right? And that is seen as a classic sort of win-lose kind of scenario. And then there is the more idealistic sort of scenario, which was developed particularly in Harvard in the 1980s, which is the win-win, which is a principled negotiation scenario, which says instead of looking at the position that someone is taking, look at the interests. What do both parties need out of this process, right? And then they believe that we can arrive at a win-win. And I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of a win-win. Actually, I would love a win-win. I find one of the problems with the way it is presented often is that it is oversimplified, right? Because there's so many relations of power. So all relationships are also relationships of power, not necessarily in a negative sense. It's just that there is a power relationship in all relationship, right? Again, to come back to parent-child, right? There is a power relationship in that relationship. But even within, with your partners, with your friends, with your colleagues, there's always a situation where a person you're talking to maybe have either officially more power than you because they're hierarchically superior, or informally, right? They have more symbolic capital. We've all been in situations where we're talking to someone where technically they're at our same level, but we know they have more or less power than we do in a specific structure. And that will affect the negotiation, but because it will affect what we're willing to give in to and what we're not willing to give in to, right? Or what we feel we should or shouldn't, right? Patriarchy has an impact on this, right? You find yourself, I don't know if you've ever had the misfortune of being in a court system, whether it's in Turkey or anywhere else, but usually not always, but the often male judge who tells the people particularly everyone in the room that they're not allowed to cross their legs, right? Things like that, which is I mean, it happened not too long ago to a friend of mine, right? Well, if you think about it, it's an extraordinary thing for a judge to say. Um, but all these cultural elements matter, patriarchal elements matter, and they affect the negotiation and how that whether a win-win is possible and who gives in, and I think those need to be taken into account very much.
Okay, I have very interesting keywords from this negotiation definition, which is it seems as though we've talked about private citizens, but it has lots of connotation with other things, corporate world and the political world. You said time is very important and interest of the parties
Yeah,
is
so
important. Bargaining, I have a question about that. Bargaining is a key word actually. And win-win, I've listened to this story of win-win in journalism and in everything that I do right now. So it's kind of funny for me. And it was interesting. You said it seems to be very simplified, which I think I agree completely with you. To be on the level, same level and power and patriarchy and cultural elements, let me pick one thing. Is negotiation a bargaining? Because in my country, Turkey, which you are very familiar with, we bargain a lot. I mean, when you buy a simple thing, we bargain. When you do something, whatever you do, it's as if you're in a constant bargaining process. So is negotiation a bargaining? We also read a lot of stories or hear the president talk about bargaining. It's politics, domestic politics is all about bargaining. So what is this? I mean, when I was a kid, bargaining was a tradesman thing. And so it's, let me stop here and let you talk about this.
So I think rather than saying is negotiation a form of bargaining, I would say that bargaining is a form of negotiation, right? So
Okay.
bargaining is a type of negotiation. It's usually based, so the covered bazaar is an excellent, absolutely fabulous example of this, in the sense that you walk into the covered bazaar, and particularly if you're a foreigner, you will walk in and everyone will see you as a potential customer, right? And the time of that relationship makes a huge difference in the approach of the carpet dealer. Let's say we're talking about carpets. The ones I'm a carpet collector. I love carpets. I love kilims, so I could buy kilims every day of the week. So you walk in, and they will decide whether um, they want a long-term relationship with you or a short-term relationship with you. So if it's a short-term relationship with you, and they don't mind what if impact this has on their reputation, and they may not necessarily be, in some cases, the most honest people. Most carpet dealers are extremely honest, right? So it's an unfair characterization, I think, of carpet dealers, but there you go. So if they want a short-term relationship and they're not particularly honest, their goal will be to make the most money out of you possible, even at the risk of cheating you, right? Because they don't care. There is no long-term relationship here. So if you walk out and you feel cheated 5 minutes later, that's fine with them. That's not a problem. So that is the worst kind of bargaining kind of situation, right? Because it's only based on that single interaction, and they want to maximize their profit. You want to maximize your gain by spending as little money as possible, but you importantly don't have knowledge. They know exactly what they're selling you, and you generally know nothing about carpets, right? So you cannot tell the difference between something that is chemical dye or natural dye. You have no idea, right? Or something that is silk or something that is synthetic. You have no idea, right? So that's the worst kind of scenario. But often, intelligent and honest carpet dealers, particularly intelligent ones, will know that you may come back. You know, maybe they find out that you're based in Istanbul. Maybe they find out that you know something about carpets, that you love carpets, and therefore their interest is to make you come back as often as possible. They want to become your friend. In which case, they are going to give you as good a deal as they possibly can, right? So they're actually going to reduce their margin as much as possible. And it's in your interest. I mean, this is all bargaining, right? But to a certain degree, by making you happy and making you feel comfortable and giving you a good deal, they get a win because you come back, and you get a win because you got a very good carpet and not a very high price. So that potentially is a win-win because it's in both people's interest that the relationship goes well, right?
Yes.
And that's a classic win-win. The idea that you're actually you're favoring the relationship rather than the immediate win.
Okay.
And that I think is a really important one, right?
Is there a school for this? Should we go to Kapalı Çarşı to learn negotiation and
Oh,
bargaining? I mean,
they're
they are wonderful. I mean, it's um do you I mean, is there a special place where people are getting this skill, especially the politicians, now that, let's go through that part a bit. Who are the people negotiators? I mean, who are them? Who are they? Are they politicians? Are they technocrats? Do they have any skills? What's your take on that? Because nowadays everyone is negotiating with the other, and so in governmental level, in corporate level, but they're not from Kapalı Çarşı. So what can you say about that?
So I think increasingly, most people who have degrees in international relations will have studied some level of negotiation and conflict resolution. It's now more or less part of most, well, not most, but a lot of international relations programs will involve some element, at least, of conflict resolution and negotiations. You have also an increasing number of courses that are specifically on conflict analysis, conflict resolution. You have several in Turkey as well. You have Koç does it, Sabancı does it, so various other universities do it in Turkey. But there are international programs. There are also short-term programs that are made specifically for politicians. Usually politicians are naturally good at it, right? Because that's how they got where they are.
That's how they're born.
Absolutely. So how did they get to the top of the pile? How did they get to be selected? How did they get to be elected? Generally because they're good negotiators quite naturally, unless they have, sometimes they have capital in other ways, but usually people who have a certain talent for negotiation will succeed in areas like politics, right? Because they know how to feel people, they know how to read people. It's very, very important to know how to read another person.
Mm.
Empathy is an absolutely, when we'll talk about skills, I'm sure, but empathy is an absolute essential part of negotiation. And empathy doesn't necessarily mean that you're a good person. It just means that you can understand what the other person is feeling, and therefore, in the best sense, try and not hurt them. In the worst sense, use it against them to your advantage, right?
Oh yes. Oh
So,
yeah.
yeah, empathy can work really both ways.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, I think there are training courses, but a lot of people who are involved in politics tend to be natural negotiators and have a sort of an inclined skill, either because they had to do it in their family, right? It's possible. They had to negotiate with a particularly difficult situation growing up, or because some people are just better at it than others. If you look at the major international negotiators, they don't tend to be trained as negotiators. So, if you think of historical negotiators as whether it is Staffan de Mistura in Syria or Lakhdar Brahimi, and also an Algerian. He was foreign minister of Algeria. One of the, I mean, he's not the youngest man now, but he was seen as a main UN negotiator for a long time. Kofi Annan was a negotiator. There are great names who have taken part in negotiation. There's luckily, an increasing group of women who have taken part who have been important mediators in negotiations. Although they still are less, and they're not quite as called as much as men.
Why is that?
Because in high politics, it is still very much of a male-dominated world, right? So women are still seen. So women have taken up quite an important space in community politics because they're seen as community builders. There's sort of this link with this this supposedly natural maternal side that women may have. But in high politics, it remains still very much of a male-dominated world where women are not necessarily are not one. I don't forget about not necessarily. They're just not taken seriously, and they really have to fight very, very hard to enter and to remain. Right.
Yes. Talking about mediators, Turkey is in a paradoxical situation, I think. I would like to hear your opinion about that. We, as a country, mediating with, in the middle of a crisis, for example, Ukraine and Russia. But then again, we have been in such a bad terms with all our neighbors. I mean, from Syria to Iraq, from Israel to Egypt, and which is a lifelong Greece, and of course EU and United States, even though we are a NATO member. So what kind, is this a paradox, or is this something? Is this a big bargaining as a negotiating skills? What is it? What do you see?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I think there is a twin track, which may be in contradiction or may support each other. It depends on what position you will take. But so on one side, I think Turkey has always had this in the middle position, right? Turkey is in the middle, in between. It's in between East and West. It's in between. It was seen as a profoundly secular country, therefore could link between sort of the more secular states of Europe and the West and the more religious states of the Middle East and further afield. It was in between it had the Black Sea, therefore it had this access to Russia that
Yes.
very few people had. So there was such an incredible potential, right, of being this go between, being in between, and therefore being the go between, right, being the mediator. And Turkey had always had aspirations for this position, right? So way back. At the same time, it has aspirations for being certainly a regional, if not a global leader in and of itself, which sort of contradicts the mediator kind of argument. So it's not, it can't be Norway, because if you want to have a major role in the actual conflict itself on the ground, well, then you can't be a neutral mediating part. You can't be Switzerland and at the same time be a major player on the ground in terms of actually acting into the country. And so there's this contradiction to a certain degree where there's this desire to be this important in-between country, and at the same time, this desire to be more than that, but to be a regional leader, to be a regional giant, and possibly a world leader, right? These aspirations don't always fit nicely together and actually
What
may
do you
work against
read?
each other.
What
Sorry?
do when you said reading was very important in negotiation and in what do you read when you look at Turkey's picture, the presenting, what Turkey is presenting as a picture? I mean, actually, you were telling me, but what do you can Turkey be a mediator, or can Turkey be, I mean, in this in between thing? What kind of a role if we need to take one of them? So.
Mm. So it's a really interesting. I think on the one side, when it comes to um, so you know the obvious example would be Russia Ukraine, right? In contexts like that, Turkey can play certainly it can be certainly a location, and therefore also a neutral sort of party that can facilitate, um, at least for now, technical negotiations, which is what they've done. And then one sees whether technical negotiations moves into other things or not. They have a privileged, so the Turkish government has a privileged relationship with certainly the Russian administration, and that potentially allows for a go-between, which is which is interesting for other parties to take advantage of and to benefit from. But that is a very specific context. I think that when it comes to other areas, Turkey is so involved as a player that that acting as a mediator becomes complicated because they are seen as potentially having too much at stake, right? I mean, I was fascinated. In 2019, I did quite a lot of traveling. I was working, I was doing a project with NATO, and I did quite a lot of traveling. And from essentially from 2016 onwards, wherever I went, there were Turkish flags everywhere. So you went to Somalia, there's Turkish flags everywhere. You go to Mali, there's Turkish flags everywhere. Go to Pakistan, there was this feeling that Turkish presence was just extraordinary in its breadth, right? It was absolutely staggering. And it was really interesting, particularly in Somalia, speaking to people in the who worked for other states, and they were saying how for Somalia is a good example because Turkey is a majority Muslim country. It is not seen as necessarily in these countries as directly linked to the West. When Turkey builds a road or builds a hospital, they can put their flag on it. When the Americans build a road and build a hospital, they can't put their flag on it. And so there's a lot, and the Brits the same, and the French the same. And what's interesting is that a lot of these countries are getting rather upset because there's Turkish flags everywhere, and all the things they build, they can't put their flags on them, right? So Turkey has this really interesting position where it can help, but it can also publicly say and show how much it's helping, right? Show how much it's present. And that is a very peculiar and very interesting position to have. And how they play this out and how they capitalize on it, I don't think we know yet, but it has an extraordinary potential.
Interesting. Yes, as a Turkish citizen, it's interesting for me as well to see different parts of this negotiation. Please go ahead. If I did I disrupt?
No. I mean, I was coming to sort of the question I would have is whether there is overstretch, right?
Yes.
Is Turkey trying to go too far and stretching too far or not? And
Yes.
what are the risks in that?
What do
Because
you
it this I tend to be on the side of the overstretch and worrying that it's stretching itself too far. At the same time, I've underestimated its reach in the past. So maybe it's just me. Right? I think I mean, I'm 48 years old, so I think people of my generation have a tendency of viewing Turkey as a middle power, right? But maybe it's just because I was raised that way and trained that way. Maybe it does have the potential of becoming greater than a middle power, and I just don't see it, right?
Okay. And that brings me to another question. There must be, I mean, everything is changing. So there must be a lot of changes in this respect as well, from the past, the present, and of course, for the future. So, as a person in international relations and with a specific interest in analyzing conflicts, which is international relations, actually, what kind of changes, I mean, vis-a-vis Turkey, we have seen that. Yes, we all, as a citizen of Turkey, I also have thought that, we are in between, we should be, we are a small or medium size, whatever, I mean, a peaceful, trying to build other skills. But it just happens that perhaps even I can't read it any longer, or I miss a lot of things between these changes. What is your opinion? What has changed? Of course, you can only talk about negotiation and the skills, but what has changed from the past? I mean, it's no longer the time of the Second World War, or it's no longer the time of the 80s, but certainly after I mean, in the future, the near future is not going to be the year of this year. I mean, it's a lot has happened this year. Please, I like to hear
Yeah.
your opinion about that.
So I think there's a major, a couple of things that come to mind. So first of all, I think we can, on at the international level, at least this is what I'm trying to say, after 20 years of the war on terror and 20 years of an international obsession with terrorism, I think we should put an end to that. I think that's enough, right? I mean, honestly, enough people have it the obsession that terrorism became in the post 9/11 world internationally has had huge repercussions on the lives of millions and millions and millions of people, but also on the international system. And I think we have finally come to an end of that, right? And there's three things potentially that have brought an end or are bringing an end to this international obsession. The first is Ukraine and interstate war, right? The return of great power politics, the return of tensions between the great powers, an actual war between states. And so interstate war hadn't gone away, but it had lost, particularly in the 1990s. If you see the change in the kinds of conflicts, you essentially move into civil wars and insurgencies in the post-Cold War period. And now there is this question of, are we moving back towards interstate war? So that's the first most important one. I think the second one is cyber, right? So I think the advent of cyber, the impact that cyber conflict has on international relations, the economics and politics of it, that I think is the second one that is replacing, certainly in the public imaginary as well, because what is seen as an international threat is also what is perceived as an international threat, right? And what has resonance with the public. So I think that's the second one. Ideally, there would be a third. I don't know if it's latching on, but the third would be climate change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Climate change would be a far more important, interesting, and relevant threat to international security than terrorism ever was, ever, right? I've spent the last 20 years of my life completely unable to understand how a powerful state like the UK, like the US, like France, like Turkey could say that their major threat to national security was terrorism. I don't understand it. I don't understand how a threat that kills, in the worst case scenario, in the UK, you're talking about 60, 70 people a year, is considered the major threat to national security. Right? It's something I don't understand. If you consider that something like 7,000 young men commit suicide a year in the UK, right? So you have 7,000 people who commit suicide a year, and you have 50 people on the worst case scenario that die of terrorism a year. And the amount of money that is put into counterterrorism compared to mental health is extraordinary, right? So we're dealing with situations where we are finally coming to the end of this era, I think, and I hope, and it is being replaced by other things. It is being replaced by something very dangerous, which is interstate war. It is being replaced by cyber war, which is potentially also dangerous, but in a very different way. And finally, it is potentially being replaced with an acknowledgement and a recognition that climate change is a major threat to everybody's security. Right?
Okay.
So
you're
that would be
talking about a difference between defense and security. Is that what I should get from this? Because defense used to be the term that we used for the last 20 years and more, and but security is today's word, or the mantra. It's security is climate change as a security matter. So let me link this to my who is a negotiator or who should be negotiating question. Used to be the defense people who negotiated, but now there are technocrats, there are climate experts or whatnot. Young people, they're also negotiating. And please proceed with a definition of terrorism. What is a terrorism, actually? Who is a terrorist? So we should also define that. I know these are big, 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 big questions, and we're not able to answer them all. But with cybersecurity, which is very important, and I believe you are developing your expertise and you're concentrating your time on that more and more. So that will take us to the cybersecurity part. It's not only, the junks that we have on our mails, but it's more than that. It's please.
So I can define terrorism if that's useful. So I'll define terrorism by saying, first of all, it has to involve violence. So civil disobedience is not terrorism. So it has to involve violence or the threat of violence. It has to be political. So it's not economic. It's not made for profit. It is made for a political goal in the broader sense of the term. And the third thing is that the target is not the person who is hurt, is not the victim of the violence, but rather the broader audience around it. So you want to induce fear in a broader audience than the immediate target. So if you blow up a bus, who's on the bus is irrelevant. What matters is the impact it has on the people around and the society around it. So that's essentially the three main elements of terrorism. But what terrorism does, and what to a certain degree cyber has taken over from, or is taking over from slowly, is that it has a very profound effect on the public, right? It induces fear, right? And therefore it is an incredibly powerful political tool. It is powerful for the people who are using it, but it is also powerful for the people who are responding to it. If you think across the world, and this is true quite literally across the world, the responses in the post 9/11 world have been extraordinary in terms of how it has curtailed civil rights, how it has curtailed minority rights. All of these things happened in the post 9/11 world because of the level of fear that the public had, which justified all these actions. What is happening, I think, is that level of fear is dying down, and it is being replaced by other questions. And I think cyber is one of the key ones. So
how fearful are we about cybers?
I think we are increasingly fearful. I think we're fearful potentially about the wrong things, but we are increasingly fearful about them, right? So cyber terrorism for the time being doesn't exist, right? We have no example of terrorist groups carrying out attacks via cyber. Now, terrorist groups do use cyber. They use cyber for communications, they use cyber for propaganda, they use cyber for information, but there is no such thing as cyber terrorists. So we can put that to a side. But there is an increasing fear, and I think part of this is justified, that foreign states or groups working for and sponsored for by states will be able to hurt countries' critical infrastructure. So we have had attacks on hospitals and on the NHS system, on the health system of various countries for the time being, and that has had repercussions. There have been attacks on entire countries, for that matter, particularly denial service attacks, and cyber was an element.
Yes.
Now, there's a debate on how important the element was, but it certainly was and continues to be an element in the Russia-Ukraine war, right?
Yes.
But it captures people's imagination, and security is also about capturing people's imagination, because when you are feared, you are powerful. But also when you have to protect your population from something they fear, you're also powerful. So the link between security and imagination is very, very important. And this is the problem climate change has always had. It hasn't been able to quite capture. Well, there's two problems. One, it hasn't been able to capture people's imagination. The second is it requires people to behave in ways they don't want to behave. People don't like recycling. People don't like taking the bus. People don't like not traveling. People don't like doing things that stop them from doing what they want to do, right?
Yes,
so
because it's about comfort zone.
exactly.
Please, let's go back to when you said when you are feared, you're powerful, and when you also secure the well-being of your people, you're also powerful. So this is a paradox as well. Now that we are facing that, everyone is fearful about on of Putin, so he is powerful, but
Yep.
then Zelensky seems to be powerful on the other side as well. So this is something very new, isn't that? I mean, and with a lot of concrete thing is happening going on, and also with cyber developments, just building everything with that. So it's interesting with the elections also. I mean, but let's talk about this.
So I think, I think the what has, and this is not, it's in no way is it a value judgment, right? But Zelensky has taken up the international role he has essentially because of Putin and because what Putin did to Ukraine. If not, he would be, the leader of a secondary country who happens to produce a whole lot of wheat, and and that essentially that's what we would be dealing with, right? And we're dealing with an international statesman who has indeed stepped up, um, and and it's because of the situation that he's in that this has happened. But I think even more relevant to a certain degree is what what the fear of Putin has done to people like Boris Johnson, to Joe Biden, right? So Johnson completely discredited at home, but still because half decent on Ukraine has some kind of a decent international reputation, which is extraordinary when you compare it to the reputation he has in his own country. Joe Biden has an international stage because he's president of the United States, but he gains a greater aura because of, I mean, then he makes mistakes, but that's another problem. But um, I think the fear and the power that, so the example I think that is most telling for me is the day of the attacks of September 11th attack. So I was in New York for that day. I was working at the Associated Press in Rockefeller Center, right? And in that moment, the amount of fear that Osama bin Laden was able to create around the world made him, to a certain degree, the most powerful man in the world in that moment because of the fear he was able to induce. And everything that happens after that is George W. Bush and the US administration in general proving that actually they are the most powerful and succeeding, right?
Yes.
Now, thousands and thousands of people have to die in the meantime on both sides. But it's a question of that fear creates that notion of power.
Okay, let me develop more on cybersecurity because it's the future.
Mm-hmm.
It's the future of your topic. I mean, I don't know, will you be developing more and more on climate dangers, but
No.
cybersecurity. I would recommend our the readers and the watchers that your TEDx speech for the Kent University about negotiating with terrorists. Now I am going to ask you the same with the same heading with a little bit of twist. How do you negotiate with the cyber terrorists, or do you negotiate with them? Are there any groups you don't negotiate, or should you be negotiating with everyone who is putting your life in danger or doing something that you don't like it? I mean, the simplest term. So please go ahead.
So there's a fundamental principle in negotiation which is called the BATNA, which is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So you have to decide what is your best alternative to negotiating, and that's a completely individual decision, right? And then you decide whether actually that alternative is not acceptable to you, and therefore at that point that's when you negotiate, right? That essentially is the moment where every individual decides that actually they do want to negotiate because the alternative is not something they want to accept. right? I mean, ideally, in an ideal world, we would negotiate anyway because we would rather not end up in violence. But that's a slightly different question. But so for a long time, and there are countries that are beginning to say we should never um, negotiate with cyber criminals, right? Cyber extortionists. People steal your data or encrypt your data, and then they say, I want $2 million, I want $200 million, I want $2 billion. If not, you don't have access to your data. Or if not, I release your data to the public. Or if not, I do both, right? So there's a whole series of ways in which this can work. And the argument, in the same way as Italy in the 1980s outlawed negotiating with people who kidnap children. So there was a large group of criminals in Italy in the 80s who would kidnap the children of very rich families. And Italy outlawed negotiating and paying a ransom. So there are countries now that are debating whether they should outlaw paying a ransom for data. Because if not, it only encourages, is the argument, it only encourages people to do it more. Right? Now, first of all, the difficulty is that these laws never really work, right? In the sense that there is always a way to negotiate, particularly in a cyber internationalized environment, which is virtual. The money can go through 200 different ways. It's not, I mean, you can't put it in your ledger at the end of the day, but companies find ways to do it, right? So already whether it's enforceable or not enforceable is questionable. But the question is, if it's not enforceable, what is the point of saying you can never negotiate? It depends on the costs that it will have to your company, to your reputation, to potential livelihoods, right? Again, put yourself in the position of a hospital administrator whose systems are down. If people are going to die, what do you do? Right?
Negotiate, of course.
So you negotiate. I mean, this is the thing, right? When you have no alternative, better solution, that's what you do, right? So the question then becomes no longer do you negotiate? It becomes how do you negotiate? And there is, interestingly, there's an increasing sort of profession in the world, which is cyber negotiators, right? So there are companies whose unique job is to negotiate for other companies that have been hacked or have had their data stolen or encrypted. There are also private individuals. I actually know a Turkish person who does this as a job. It's his job. He negotiates between companies, and so it's a very interesting job, right? So they get contacted, they act as intermediary, they get a cut of the money, or they get a cut of the money that's saved, depending on the deal that's made. And it's a fascinating kind of new profession that has come out, right? So it's no longer the cybersecurity expert, it's a cyber negotiating expert. So the question then becomes, so how do you negotiate? What are the specificities of negotiations in cyber? So first of all, you don't know who you're dealing with. There is no face-to-face contact, which also has an impact. Often, my understanding is that particularly when you're dealing with highly organized and large criminal groups, you're not necessarily dealing with the same person because these people work a 24-hour day. And so different person will answer depending on the time zone that they are in. So you're not negotiating with the same person, which also has an impact because no rapport can be built, or it's more difficult to build a rapport. The person is not necessarily, cannot make any executive decisions. They always have to report up, right? Because they're just the person doing the immediate discussion. The question then becomes, does the cyber criminal have a reputational risk, right? Do they want to continue or not? Is it a one hit? Again, comes back to the carpet. Is it a one hit and therefore they can try everything? Or do they want to remain in the field as a decent criminal, right? It's a really so there's so many elements that come into it, which are absolutely fascinating. So my next job is to pick out these various elements and come up with a framework on what is the impact of cyber on negotiation frameworks.
Okay, and when are you targeting this?
Ooh, spring, summer, something like that.
Actually, very soon.
The next 10 years.
The next 10 years. Wow. So the next 10 years, we will also see other topics, other experts on the negotiation table. actually, as I mean, climate change is also as interesting as cybersecurity. But I think the threat that we feel at the moment, I mean, the generational gap is something that prevents us to grasp the importance of what's going on at the moment. So this is a transitional period. So the last thing, let's put it an end to. What do you see for the 2023 and let's say the 2025 period, which is a very small period of time, but you've said cybersecurity, climate change, so a change in the minds of people with politics. But from your perspective, would you pinpoint other things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the great rivalry between the US, Russia, and China is going to be increasingly important in terms of whether it is in Ukraine, whether it is in the South China Sea. I think we're moving towards I mean, it may not come out in the next 3 years, right? But there will the relations between particularly these three great powers are being played out in ways in the next, let's say, 5 years that will then have an impact in a much longer period in the lives of our children and our grandchildren, I would say. So that is something that needs to be followed very closely. And how the various smaller powers position themselves in that battle is going to be fascinating. So, I mean, it's the regional giants that are the most interesting to watch, right? It's India, Pakistan, South Africa, Brazil. They are very interesting to watch in terms of how they will position themselves in this major battle.
Would you consider Turkey's role be interesting in the future as well?
Absolutely fascinating. I think particularly when it comes to the US and Russia, no doubt about it, but its entire position also with respect to what is happening in the Middle East, to Syria, but also further beyond, right? What is the whole battle of influence, let's say, across the Middle East. Turkey remains an absolutely central player. And as I say, beyond, in parts of Africa as well. I mean, it has a crucial role to play, and whether it decides to do so more as a mediator or more as a power play, we will have to see.
Yes, it's going to be interesting. And I think this is what you meant about when you say, when I see conflict, I don't see it negative. I see it as an opportunity. So this is the opportunity side, perhaps. You haven't used the opportunity word actually, but you may change it. I don't want to distort it.
No, I mean, I think conflict is an opportunity in the sense that tension is an opportunity, right? Now, the opportunity is to transform that tension into a positive transformation rather than into violence. That is the great challenge. Unfortunately, my concern is that where we are in the moment in international relations, I don't see very many actors, certainly at high politics, sort of governmental level, trying to do that. It is a lot of very traditional power, violent understandings of conflict and tensions, and there's a lot of work to be done to transform that into more positive and less violent responses to tension, which we're not, unfortunately, not very good at the moment, I would say.
This has been a great conversation, especially for me when I see you, a person started a career with journalism and turned out, who is reporting conflicts and whatever tensions, and now an expert on conflict resolution and negotiating and trying to dissolve the tension in the threats and everything. So it's interesting, I think, from where you have started, from where you are, I mean, to where you're going. Do you see that as an interesting transition?
Oh
You're
yeah, I mean, absolutely. I always joke that so I have my father is Turkish and my grandfather was a Turkish historian, Taha Toros, and he was a wonderful man, but he was also an interesting man to negotiate with. And I always joke that I learned to negotiate with him, right? And therefore I learned I learned the art of negotiation quite young because I had that was the way to do it. But and I think anyone who's had a Turkish dede knows how hard it can be to negotiate. But yeah, I mean, I think it's always been my fascination to negotiate my way in and out of situations and see what works and what doesn't work, right? I mean, and I think what I tell my students all the time is that the way we think of conflict at international level, we need to bring back to the personal, right? We need to bring it back and try and apply it in our daily lives of trying to transform these tensions into positive change, right? And that is the real challenge to do this for us, right? Um, on a daily basis.
Well, thank you so much. It's been pleasure having you, and thank you for devoting your time. I know you're busy. Harmonie Toros from University of Kent, an associate professor. Let's put it in the right context.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you,
Thank
Rafal.
you, and have a good day in Rome.
Thank you. Bye
Bye.
bye.